In our lesson for January the 10th, we continue our study of the Sermon on the Mount, and we're picking up now in chapter 6. As Jesus describes the kingdom life, he outlines three disciplines: giving, praying, and fasting. Our text actually looks at two of these, praying and fasting. So begin with me now, verse 5 of chapter 6. He talks about prayer. Now, from the very beginning of the Bible, prayer plays a significant part in the lives of those who want to relate properly to God. Prayer is the dynamo that energizes us to be the people of God. And that's why Jesus includes that as one of the disciplines as he spells out the life of discipleship for those who are a part of his kingdom. And basically, here's the key idea. He calls for a different kind of praying than was practiced by the Jews, and a different kind of praying that was practiced by the Gentiles. Those are the two ideas that we'll explore here. First of all, he calls in verses 5 through 6, he calls for his disciples to practice a kind of prayer that is distinct from the practice of the Jewish religious leaders. Now, as in the area of giving and fasting, the religious leaders of Jesus' day prayed and tried to use their prayer as a way of calling attention to themselves. They had 3 times a day when they would pray: 9 a.m., 12 o'clock noon, and 3 p.m. And they would pray by falling on their knees and turning their attention to the temple and saying their prayers to God. Now, what they would do was to schedule their time so that when 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock came, they were always surrounded by a crowd of people. So that when they fell to their knees and did their public praying, all the crowd around them would look at them and ooh and awe over their righteousness. In other words, they were doing this in order to enhance their own reputation instead of actually communicating to God. Now, surprisingly, or interestingly, I guess, Jesus tells the disciples that the religious leaders accomplished their purpose. Look at what he says, chapter 6, verse 5. When you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogue or on the street corners to be seen by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. In other words, Jesus says, why are they praying? Because they want to call attention to themselves. And guess what? They're successful. That's what they do. But, Jesus implies, they're missing the whole point of what prayer is about. Jesus acknowledges the purpose of prayer for his disciples, the opportunity to come into a closer relationship with God. And to experience that purpose of prayer, he calls for the disciples to do a different kind of praying than the religious leaders do. Jesus demands private prayer for the purpose of divine approval instead of public prayer for the purpose of human approval. Since our praying is to God, praying in private is the best way to do it. He says in verse 6, but when you pray, go into your room, close the door, pray to your Father who is unseen, and then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. He also wants the disciples to practice a kind of prayer that is distinct from the prayer of the Gentiles. And he refers to this now in verses 7 and 8. The pagans of Jesus' day, that is the Gentiles, also distort prayer, but not by making it public, but by making it unintelligible. He says in verse 7, when you pray, do not keep on babbling like the pagans. I think a great example of this is Acts chapter 19, verse 34. According to Acts 19:34, the Gentiles there that described in Ephesus, for 2 hours, Acts 19:34 says, these people stand up and they cry out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Now picture the scene here. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of the Gentiles all of them shouting one time after another for 2 hours, "Greatest Artemis of the Ephesians." They are saying it at different pitches, different voices, different times. That's the kind of babble that Jesus has in mind when he says in verse 7, "Do not keep on babbling like the pagans." Instead, he calls for intelligent prayers. He says they think they'll be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask them. In other words, pray prayers that God will respond to, clear, intelligent prayers, not babbling